This panel is entitled Moments, and as you can see from this title, but also from the titles of the other panels, these are very open titles, so they are prone to a lot of projection. So I allowed myself, because I also asked myself, how do the two presentations which we will hear, how do they relate to each other? And I tried to find an answer by thinking about the question of moments, and also maybe thinking about the question how moment is pivotal for this kind of exhibition. And one thing that I think this exhibition brings back to mind is that we are talking, when we are talking about television, we are talking about a medium with a specific program, and this specific program tells you when to see what. So I would say it's a structure or a dispositif that creates moments. And if you relate this to the question of when do certain perspectives become visible, I think television then could be seen as a dispositif that creates moments or can create moments in which, for example, marginalized perspectives and so on can become visible in a larger sense, or not only in a cinema for 20 people, but maybe on a television program for, let's say, 250 people or something like this. Yeah, so that was maybe one way to think about this question of moments and how they, or how it relates to the two presentations which we are about to hear. The first one is by Ömer Alkin, and the second one is about Rachel Garfield. By Rachel Garfield. I will first introduce Ömer Alkin. Ömer Alkin is Professor for Applied Media and Communication Sciences at the Hochschule Niederrhein and head of the German Research Foundation project Aesthetics of Occidentalism. He has published widely, especially in the field of, or in the context of post-migrant discourses, among them post-migrant memory, culture, and media history, the figure of the migrant in Turkish cinema, which came out in 2020. And I have the German title here for this one, Die visuelle Kultur der Migration, Geschichte, Ästhetik und Polyzentrierung des Migrationskinos in 2019. So please give a very warm welcome to Ömer Alkin.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Alejandro, for this wonderful introduction, and Mark Siegel and Alexandra Schneider for giving me the possibility to talk here a little bit about what I now call, you see the title change, Subaltern, Phantasies, Postmigration Film and ZDF, das Kleine Fernsehspiel. I have no written paper that, or anything very strictly orchestrated for this talk, because the topic is very difficult to me and I tend to talk too much and have a long talk. So I tried to restrict myself by having only some slides with the text on it and trying to somehow comment on the slides. And yeah, I would say I just begin, and I thought my talk would be in German, so if I have struggle in trying to explain what I mean with the slides, then maybe you can help me. Post-migration, I would like to start with this term, and I tried to at least refer to three definitions or aspects of this very complex academic, I would say, academic term, and the one is the descriptive category. To use it as a descriptive category, namely for trying to name people that don't have a migration, not biography, but migration experience themselves, so who did not actually cross a national border and decide to live in a different nation state. But still these people are affected by migration discourses and regimes, so named migrants, so anyone who grew up in Germany and did not migrate himself is actually a post-migrant, one could say. The other aspect is understanding post-migrant or post-migration as an analytical strategic category. You can use the term for the description of the fundamental significance of migration for the cultural situation. This is what most of the scholars from migration studies use the term. They want to say yes, nation states are there, and this is a structure and some kind of governmental strategy, and this is how we categorize all these things. But actually, in our lives, we must say migration is rather fundamental and the more correct anthropological category to deal with our realities. So migration is not the exception, but it's actually the normality. This is what post-migration also refers to. And this third definition one is again a strategic category. Strategic because you're argumenting, at least with the second definition, against academia or people that still want a national methodology. So the third definition is a conscious essentialism, reappropriation of the migration discourse. Saying that, it means that there are subjectivities or subjects that do not want to be part of a migration discourse that makes them the other, so othering, saying that you are a migrant, that you are Turkish, you're not really belonging, and trying to somehow flee from that violent act of being named as migrant and saying, okay, you cannot name me migrant, I'm a post-migrant myself, so taking over that category. It is connected to the first one, but I would separate it analytically. Okay, and now let's move on to the topic or the reason why we are all here, to celebrate ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel and think about it. And from a very specific point of view that came up by Özgür's wonderful talk earlier, German-Turkish Kurdish cinema, actually one must say, not with regard to ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, but with regard to, if we call it the genre, Austrian, Swiss, German, Turkish, Kurdish cinema, just to hint at the problems of national categories. So if we want to understand the history, unfortunately I don't have any posters because I tend to explain too much then. Cinema of the affected. This is a term that came up in the academic discourse about the films that were made in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, and they were dealing with the so-called Gastarbeiterinnen, films that were depicting them as some kind of pitiful existence. Helma Sanders, Brahms, Shirin's Hochzeit. I name a few films, not all of them are related to ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, but in 1976 it was made, and it shows the struggles of a Turkish woman that migrates to Cologne in order to marry her youth love, but then is oppressed by capitalistic structures and patriarchy. It's a very leftist film, and we could characterize these films as very showing solidarity with the lives of guest workers. Yeah, and these films that show the Gastarbeiterinnen as pitiful subjects were then of course, critically addressed later on, because they were saying, I mean, we are speaking for these people, please let them speak themselves. And but saying that, there is actually no, or at least from my point of view, film that somehow is able to representatively perform this act. The situation with these films changed. I mean, Gastarbeiterinnen refers also to the idea that they are sometime the guest should leave. He comes, nice, but please leave. But with the 1980s, this perspective changed, and politics and film culture, etc., understands, culture itself understands, or in Germany, it is understood that they will stay. They will stay, so we have to refer to them, and we refer to them as the others. And the films that you can find in the 1980s especially are films that are dealing with the issue of the women that cannot be integrated. Yeah, so women that are oppressed or sent back to Turkey, that should marry a Turkish guy in Germany or in Turkey, and there is a German white savior that saves the oppressed Turkish women from this kind of oppression. So films that I would say that they are not dealing with the Gastarbeiter solidarity from a leftist perspective with them, but films that show that the migrants in Germany should integrate themselves, because with an archaic Muslim culture, it's not possible to stay in Germany. So you must believe me. Unfortunately, it's just thesis, but you can read all the things that many scholars wrote about these things. Pleasures of hybridity. Now we're with the ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel. In this situation of films that depict guest workers rather as nude victims, and then migrants as being the others, the Muslim others, Claudia Trogne especially, made it possible that migrant filmmakers could depict somehow what they think could be told about migration. And these were films, and Özgür, I'm very happy that you showed at least some posters that showed that national identity is a very difficult thing, and we should try to deal with rather living together, and hybridity is one of the concepts that makes it possible to deal with living together. I would try to sum up these. The term pleasures of hybridity goes back to an analysis done by Deniz Göktürk, who's here right now. I can't see over there. And it's a term coined by Sarita Malik, who was writing on British black cinema from the 1980s and 90s. And so we could say that ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, with giving these migrant voices or migrant positions the possibility to make their films, made it problematical. Yeah, and after that, Fatih Akın came, and there was not a lot to say, except having some academics that were talking the whole time about transculturality and hybridity, and that we're a cosmopolitan society and a global society with its complex films, etc., etc. And then things happened. Ethno-comedies, cultural clash comedies started to show up on the screens. Films about racism got possible due to the NSU affair or killings. Different discourses showed up, just like is the theme of Islam, but one has to say, okay, in the beginnings of the 2000s, that actually one thought, due to 9/11, that also film culture will refer, so funded, öffentlich-rechtlich funded, you know what I mean. Public service broadcasting will support films that deal critically with Islam after 9/11, but that was not the case. Actually, I couldn't find any. I did a large research on films from Germany about, or fictional films on Islam and Muslim culture, and there were no real depictions that were made with public service until 2015. Then it starts again, but with the Flüchtlingswelle, wave of... Okay, yes. Sorry for that. So this is the other issue that is discursively you can find on screen if you somehow try to understand what is going on with regard to migrants in German television or cinema. And the other thing is that somehow after 2010, films on the gangster milieu were possible again. This was one issue that also was not touched a lot by public service due to racism issues. I would say ZDF Kleine Fernsehspiel, die Redaktion, the editors were aware that they did not want to refer to racist stereotypes with the films. This is what I would, from a macroscopical level of analysis, could say about these films, and this is something that I think is very honorable for such an editing team, that they did not react to the 9/11 thing by somehow dealing with the issue in a racist way, and also with these two genres, Islam and gangster milieu. But the effect was that less migrant issues at all were dealt with. This was the dilemma. So not trying to trap into the stereotype or racist trap led to different decisions of ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel. I would analyze this. This is a thesis I would postpone. Yeah, but one could say ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, this is a thesis, is of course a medium for marginalized subaltern forms of knowledge. But what needs to be researched? I can tell you, if you are interested in doing research on the topics, please help us understanding who watched these films. Post-migrant media consumption. We do not know what, even if these films were watched by the migrants themselves, we don't have real data on it. I mean, we know that migrants are not watching different media content, at least from Media Monitor, Integration, etc. But I mean, there you have again this problematic category of who is a migrant. It's very difficult for empirical research to find out or to find a definition with which you can say, okay, this is a Turkish migrant and he's also watching a lot of Turkish TV. This is a very, very difficult research question, and it goes back to the to this very difficult category of migrant. Who is a migrant? What generations of migration background gives us the possibility to name one a migrant, etc., etc. And post-migrant media content. This is at least what I tried to do with my PhD. I tried to make visible parts of this media consumption. And for this, I would like to refer to a film that was produced by ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, remake, remix, ripoff by Cem Kaya. I'm pretty sure that some of you know his new film that was not made with ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel, and so far as I'm informed correctly, it's Aşk Mark ve Ölüm. But back then in 2014, he made this film about Turkish film culture. And this is what migrants were watching in the 1980s on VHS tapes. But the thing is, the film is not about migrant media consumption, but it's like a documentary on Turkish culture solely. It has nothing to do with the migrant culture at all. And this was a possibility to refer to the life or the situation of migrant media consumption here. And I think Cem Kaya tried to somehow make things good by sticking to the migrant culture in Germany. Okay, do I have still time to talk a little bit, or I don't know? Okay. Yeah, and Anam, I wanted to show you this film by Buket Alakush, which was made in 2001, about a Turkish cleaning Putzfrau. Cleaning lady, okay, cleaning lady. And Anam means my mother, it's a Turkish word for my mother. And this is one of the moments where you can find, this is also an analysis, I have to aesthetically prove that, but I'm pretty sure that Yeşilçam, who knows what Yeşilçam is? Could you please raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, okay. Yeşilçam is the popular film culture of Turkey that was made in the 1960s and 70s. And I think that Yeşilçam modality tells a lot about at least Turkish culture at all. And it's a modality, actually. It's a very specific way of telling things. It's a very commercial film culture. Around 200 to 300 films were made yearly at that time in the 60s and 70s. And it refers to a specific modality. And this modality can be described as being very melodramatic, being very focused at affects, at emotions, trying to evoke sadness and one could say body genre. It's very body genre oriented way of filmmaking. And Anam includes these moments, as the story of Anam is about the cleaning woman that tries to save her son from his drug abuse. And it's a very emotional way of dealing with a narrative, with plot. I don't know who was responsible for Anam back then at the at the time who was the editor, but I'm pretty sure, and I would love to ask Buket Alakush whether she tried to make a Yeşilçam movie, and some hybrid, the film is still very different from what Yeşilçam is, but this is what came out if you, I would say, make a Yeşilçam movie and then doing it with the subjectivity as a the subjectivity of an editor as a medium. So how can one make subaltern knowledge visible? I would say this is a hybrid thing between mainstream German editing subjectivity and yeah, bodily affected Yeşilçam modality. Okay, so I would close with some thesis again, everything based on thesis. I would say epistemic violence is a very important issue when dealing with the whole situation of migrant culture and filmmaking. So adaptation versus resistance. If one wants to become a filmmaker, he has to show some, at least, integration into film culture itself. So if you are at a party, of course, and you are a rather Muslim filmmaker, okay, how do you deal with it? If you don't drink, will you be excluded? And how far does that affect the sociality of producing a film? We were told that Yüksel Yavuz was not considered to make a Große Fernsehspiel because he was schüchtern. Imagine he did not drink alcohol. Emancipation versus tradition. So how can one be part of something emancipating if there is a specific way of doing things? So I'm referring to the film conventions. So conventions that, I mean, know-how was something that, I don't know which talk this was, but it was about know-how. In how far, or what are the limits of the Kleines Fernsehspiel? What can be a limit? How can these limits look like? Hybridity, is this all? I mean, there are specific knowledges, as I showed you with remake, remix, ripoff. These are Turkish film culture, but they are connected somehow to the people that are living here. And this means we still need the category of nationalism if we don't want to oppress situated knowledge. So if you just, like Fatih Akin, put away the transcultural, or take over the transcultural thing and the hybridity thing, you become somehow blind for very specific situated forms of knowledge. So we must be aware of what pleasures of hybridity means at all. Again, this perspective on racism and stereotypes resulted in fewer films made by ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel. This is what I would say. Okay, things are changing. Future. I wanted to molest you with some considerations about the future. A culture of remembrance. I mean, Aşk, Mark ve Ölüm, Liebe, D-Mark und Tod is a film about the dying generation of guest workers. Yüksel Yavuz's film, My Vater der Gastarbeiter, I don't know, maybe he passed away. There is a generation of people that belong to migration culture and they will not be here anymore, and we will not have the possibility to tell their stories. What is the responsibility of media or film culture to take over these aspects? Yeah, and I would say if we know, yeah, how can we deal with it? I'm still struggling. Okay, and now I close with just a very, we'll see. Das kleine Fernsehspiel has dared the utopias. That was good, well done. But now it is maybe to throw itself off the cliff, I would say. I don't know. Okay, this is time for.
So thank you, Ömer, Alkin, for this presentation and also for going out with a bang. So after you will follow, as I said, a presentation by Rachel Garfield. We are very happy to have her here. Rachel Garfield is an artist, author, curator, and professor for fine arts in the Royal College of Art in London. She was head of the project The Legacies of Stephen Dwoskin's personal cinema between 2018 and 2022, and is co-editor of Dwoskino, The Gaze of Stephen Dwoskin, which was published by Lux in in 2022, and which she also holds here, and which I had the brief chance to take a look at, and it's really a beautiful book. And she was also the author of Experimental Filmmaking and Punk, Feminist Audio-Visual Culture in the 1970s and 80s, published in 2022. She has published widely on lens-based works, identity politics, and feminism, and is here with us today to speak about Behindert, Stephen Dwoskin's film, as a pivotal moment. Welcome.
Okay, I just want to thank the organisers for inviting me. It was a really lovely surprise to be included in this. I think it's quite important because Dwoskin was very involved with ZKF, and I thought I'd just start quickly with this telegram, blast from the past. The Dwoskin archive has a lot of materials, and this is just one of them, because Behindert was a very important film at the time. It was very successful, even though it's been almost completely forgotten. I thought we were going to show a bit of the film, so I'm just showing some screenshots. The quality is not that amazing, but then it was filmed on quite old technology now anyway, so it would never be 4K or 5K or anything. It'd be a bit fuzzy. So I'm just going to start reading and also move this along as well. So Stephen Dwoskin was an artist, filmmaker, writer, and key animator of the independent and experimental film scene in London in the 1970s and 1980s. Dwoskin worked across the borders and categories of film, as well as those of art. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1939. He had a high profile as a graphic designer on Madison Avenue in the late 1950s. In addition to his design career, Dwoskin began to make his own films, counting Jonas Mekas, Andy Warhol, Jack Smith, Shirley Clark, Yvonne Rainer, amongst his associates, obviously, that whole milieu and generation he knew in the New York underground. In 1964, Dwoskin, the screenshots are just random. It's chronological, but it's random in terms of my text, by the way. In 1964, Dwoskin arrived in the UK, having won a Fulbright scholarship as a graphic designer, which he taught at the London College of Communication until he took up a professorship of film at the Royal College of Art, where I'm now teaching. So apart from the founding of the London Filmmakers Co-op, which is quite a sort of amazing thing with a really long legacy, which is now the Lux, in London, Dwoskin is probably most remembered in the UK as the writer of the book Film Is. However, as an artist, he kept moving and developing new spheres of interest and communities. He was active in disability rights and taught at alternative educational setups such as the Anti-University in the 1970s, which again was quite a big deal in the 1970s. In his lifetime, he made over 50 films that followed three distinctive periods: the early underground films, the commissioned and feature films in the 1970s and 80s, of which this is a part, and the personal, experimental, low-budget films from the late 1990s onwards, which was partly because he couldn't get the funding anymore, but also as he got older, his disability left him, less able to have those big productions or make those big productions. So Dwoskin's early films were about desire, both the need for it and its power to alienate. These works are the classic works that are most written about from the New York underground days, and were made in New York, most of them, but some were finished in London. With Ron Geeson, who did a lot of his early sound work, and then Gavin Bryars, who did the sound on this film and a lot of his mid work until they fell out, which is another story, which I can tell you when I'm drunk. His concerns in many ways were generational and to do with breaking out of bourgeois morality that is usually associated with the 1950s. In that sense, his work and concerns as an artist can be seen to be deeply entwined with the New York underground. Steve often used to recommend I See Pull My Daisy, a 1959 film by Alfred Leslie and Robert Frank, which actually I critique a lot in my other book about feminism, punk and experimental film, which was in some ways a touchstone for him. The Powell and Pressburger film Peeping Tom from 1960 was also a key touchstone for Dwoskin, as were lots and lots of other films, actually, so which I could go into again, but I'm not going to now. He was fascinated by voyeurism as a psychological state. In the interviews he conducted to prepare for another film by ZDF, commissioned by ZDF in 1981, Outside In. Sorry, I kind of made up that sentence in a very different way to how I wrote it. So he talked repeatedly about being stared at the impact it had on him, and the ways in which he felt an outsider, always looking in at society and the world. Dwoskin himself stated in Cinem 3, and I quote, "People look at films in the same way that they look at each other, very distant from it all. In other words, they look at, but are seldom involved in," end of quote. So while his early New York films were about being, and I quote again, looked at, Behindert, his first film by ZDF, became about being involved in. So this was quite a shift from the films that the films that he'd done earlier. So to go back to this looking at for a minute, he was, and this is a particular interest of mine, he was lambasted and sidelined by feminist writers and filmmakers in the 1980s in the UK and the US, and I'm speaking as a feminist myself. What complicates the gaze for Dwoskin, and not often considered in the writings about him, was his disability. And I have to state here also that Laura Mulvey's foundational text, Visual Pleasure, A Narrative Cinema, of 1974, published the same year actually as Behindert came out, was developed in discussion with Dwoskin. They were neighbours and close friends at the time, and had in the first instance included one of his films, Trixie, from 1969, in its early iteration, and she took it out when she decided that it was going to be a feminist polemic, and that had like a huge impact on Dwoskin's career, which plummeted in those years. Dwoskin caught polio at the age of 9. He almost died and spent 6 formative years in hospital before finally going back to live with his family. So he was 15 when he lived with his family. At one time as a child, he was mute through the polio as well. Before then, he'd been sent to a military school, before the age of 9, that is, because he was so unruly where he caught the disease. His father was a unionised government worker, which allowed him to have health care for his polio, and he came from quite a politically active family. In fact, his grandfather was fought in the Odessa uprising. Interesting tidbit. So he was bused daily to school, far away from home, because of building accessibility issues. And when he was there, he ate lunches with the other disabled kids in the kitchen at school. So he was always separated from others, even when he did go to school. He was, in fact, an autodidact, making up for his lack of education with a voracious appetite for reading. And while I don't want to overstate the biographical, I know I've gone on about it, but in reading Dwoskin's work, it is difficult to completely ignore his subject position and his years of exclusion from society, where he describes again and again being an onlooker throughout his formative years. So voyeurism was a key part of his outlook. I originally put Weltanschauung, but then I was too embarrassed to say a German word in a German context, both as subject of being looked at for his disability and being an onlooker of others because of being an outsider. So I believe he used the look in his films to subvert expectations of power in the cinematic gaze and the viewer's experience of it. And it's a shame you didn't see the beginning of Behindert. There's like 11 minutes of Carola Rainier just looking at him, looking out at us. This kind of looks back and forth, and it is very powerful and a very interesting way of using looking. So Dwoskin met Beatrice Cordua, also known as Trixie, an experimental dancer in 1970, who's still doing amazing experimental dance work. Mark was telling me yesterday they immediately clicked and fell in love, as demonstrated in the film Trixie, which is actually about them falling in love in a way through the camera in real time. They were lifelong friends, and it was Trixie who introduced Dwoskin to Carola Rainier, who was to co-star in Behindert. Trixie, is there a problem? Oh, I wondered what the flashing was. It's a flicker film. I hope there's no one with epilepsy in the audience. Obviously, the whole system is tired. It's at the end of the day. Okay, thank you. So Trixie also introduced Dwoskin to... so he met Trixie. Trixie introduced him to Eckhart Stein at ZDF, which inaugurated a professional relationship that was to last 25 years and several films. Dwoskin had been thinking of making a film about disability since 1967, according to his diaries, but the idea gelled in conversation with Stein in the early 1970s when he proposed a film about, and I quote, the conflict arising between an able-bodied person and a disabled one. The film would show how this disparity becomes the excuse for the failure of their relationship, end of quote. In the same text, he adds, this is from his treatment, I was building the whole scenario on my own personal experience with women, unquote. So Behindert was the first of his films that dealt directly with disability, funded by ZDF as part of what became a trilogy about handicaps. So most of his other films previously were about looking out at people, mostly focused on women or on sexual liberation and so forth. But in this film, he turned the camera on himself. And this was part of a trilogy about disabilities funded by ZDF. The others were Outside In, made in 1981, and Silent Cry in 1977. Outside In is an autobiographical reenactment of responses to him and his disability. And the film is structured as a series of witty and deflationary vignettes. So these are all things that happened to him. It's quite slapstick, it's quite funny, but also tragic. Silent Cry is an impressionistic narrative, a portrait of a woman unwittingly crushed by the men around her who love her in ways that undermine her sense of self. Heard that before. It's quite Bergman-esque. And Pain Is was the last film funded by ZDF, jointly with Arte. And in fact, ZDF came in very late on in this film because he was in dispute with Arte, or Art, I don't know how you pronounce it, because of partly money and partly to do with a segment of the film that was about S&M, which is also in Pain Is. So, yeah, so, sorry, I lost myself there. Ostensibly a linear feature, Behindert visually narrates the arc of a relationship from the first meeting with a 10-minute incremental play of looks between them to the distressing end, where you watch Carola walk away through the window. It is an intense expressionist film that pinpoints critical moments of disparity between the two lovers. Dwoskin describes this film in his treatment as a subjective documentary, and it is almost a reenactment of the relationship he had with Carola, adding some complexity to the film that blurred boundaries between a fictionalized composite of other relationships and the one that had occurred between the two protagonists in real life before the film was made. Steve was very interested in kind of an expanded documentary, if you like, and I think he saw this as a kind of genre, there it goes again, genre busting. Oh, it's not even showing the whole thing. Sorry. It's like half a slide. So he describes it as a subjective documentary, and it is almost a reenactment of the relationship he had with Carola, adding some complexity to the film that blurred boundaries between, have I already said this, a fictionalized composite of other relationships and the one that had occurred between the two protagonists in real life before the film was made. So Dwoskin reinforces this intra-genre aspect to the work in the oscillation between abstraction and narrative in the camera work. For some reason, it's not. Dwoskin's abstract perception of the world is key, but an understated component of the film. He finds abstraction in the structure of the frame and the architecture of the image, which he then uses to destabilize and interrupt the flow of the narrative. He does this particularly effectively to demonstrate the vertiginous nature of navigating stairwells, or the inability to run after his escaping love, exposing the full abjection of the polio-scarred body. Sorry, I've almost finished. In his attempt to do so. This dovetails with a tight focus on the face, on the fragmented gestures, the hands, the smile, and particularly the look of the eyes that all operate as a penetrating study of emotion and internal struggle. On the one hand, the abstraction is a testament to Dwoskin's painterly origins, while on the other, it acts as a distancing mechanism, adding a further layer of narrativization through the visual. So at the heart of Dwoskin's visual language is a paradox, a craving for intimacy that relationships promise, and the insatiability of desire that forecloses the possibility of real intimacy. So rather than mere sexual desire, with which Dwoskin is often associated, this is the desire to connect deeply with other human beings, of which obviously sexual connection is one aspect. The treatment for Behindert was shaped by the sense that for Dwoskin, his disability was the source of this foreclosing. And in it, he explored the effects of his disability on his amorous encounters. So for Dwoskin, the paradox in all of his films is the overwhelming desire to connect with another and the very impossibility of being able to do so. This is obviously informed by psychoanalytic thought, which he read a lot and was very interested in, and of course surrealism, which was also one of his passions. And his relationship to, or his connections with surrealism became again more overt, as did the interiority, or the kind of using the camera for give a sense of interiority in his later films. Sorry, this is my last paragraph. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but Behindert was a pivotal film for Dwoskin, one that marked the beginning of a new direction that put his hero, keep his body there, put his own body on the screen and deepened the sophistication and complexity away from exploring sexual liberation per se into working with biography, literary adaptation and documentary. So after Behindert, he embarked on a series of extensive interviews, on extensive interviews with his friends that allowed him to open up to his life. It gave him the material for Outside In 1981, and then later for the history of representation of disability in the documentary Face of Our Fear, 1992, and Pain Is from 1997. Later in his own low-budget experimental films, he returns again to the themes of disability and interiority in a very personal way. Sorry, I've already said that. That explores, with Trying to Kiss the Moon, which is a beautiful film if you ever get the chance to see it, and Intoxicated by My Illness, which is one of my favourites from 2001, and Sun and Moon, which is 2007. So Behindert was the first film where he would turn the camera on himself and would define an ongoing engagement with the impact of disability on his life within his work. Sorry, that ending's a bit kind of underwhelming, but thank you. And if anyone wants to see the book, I've got it here.
So once again, Ömer and Rachel, thank you for your presentations. Maybe to get into the discussions, and I think we will also quickly open to the audience, because I could imagine there are a lot of questions and remarks maybe. But to maybe go back to this idea of a moment, which I tried to elaborate a little bit on before you talked, and it was something I dealt with in kind of preparing for this discussion, because I thought somehow these questions of which perspectives become visible at which points are questions of moments, and moments are interactions of different, or intersections of different moments actually. So a moment becomes something when two or three things happen at the same time. And I wanted to ask you, Rachel, you talked about the film Behindert being basically the beginning of the second phase of Dwoskin's cinema. I was looking at the book Dwoskin's Cinema, and Ömer, you were talking about basically, like you said, it's not actually that easy to say, like, to make this distinction between maybe migrant and post-migrant cinema. But one thing I saw when I looked at the films that were, for example, chosen for this exhibition is that in the 90s, there is a moment where post-migrant cinema from a German, Turkish/Kurdish perspective becomes very present in the middle of the 90s. And I wanted to ask the two of you, so why are these, like, do these moments exist, or are they just a coincidence by an editor being interested suddenly in post-migrant cinema from a Turkish-Kurdish perspective, or in a filmmaker who actually is disabled and makes films about these? Or why do you think these moments happened? Because they change a lot that comes afterwards.
Well, I don't think there's one global answer for, you know, both of these things. But I think someone mentioned earlier today about how often there are things that become really important in a film, which are actually to do with quite pedestrian reasons, be it money or something. And I think Steve had been thinking about making a work around disability for quite a while. And I think it was a mixture of being given the green light by Eckhart Stein, but also I think having had this relationship with Carola Renier, who was an actress and someone he had a relationship with, that he could envisage making a film about a relationship with her. So I think that kind of those two things made it possible to actually do it. I don't know what gave him the courage to turn the camera on himself, because if anyone's seen the film, there's some very abject moments, which I think is incredibly brave to make, where he reveals, you can see his I think, you know, I showed you a couple of, so I think, but I think it was some actually very practical things that kind of got him to that. And once he'd done it, then that kind of allowed him to embark on a kind of much deeper kind of investigation of disability than he'd first started with.
But can I also follow up? Do you know anything about why Eckhart Stein even like addressed Stephen Dwoskin? Because somehow, if you look at, like, I don't know all the films that were produced by das Kleine Fernsehspiel, but Stephen Dwoskin really sticks out, not just because he is the only filmmaker I know of who has a disability and speaks about it in his film, but also because he comes from a cinematic tradition that is not present even in das Kleine Fernsehspiel, which is this kind of materialist co-op kind of that you also talked about, that was in the US was New American Cinema, and in the UK was connected to the film co-op.
Well, I mean, Steve was quite a big deal in those days. I mean, he'd won major prizes he won the Golden something or other. Sorry, I can't remember details these days. At Knocker, you know, so he was hot stuff. And so I think that was one of the things. And also I think that Trixie had introduced them. So there was already, you know, two ways in which, you know, he was deemed to be acceptable. So I think they were probably very interested in producing a film by him because he was a big name, relatively speaking. So, but I think Steve was also very persuasive. I think he was and very used to negotiating with people. I mean, he'd been a very celebrated graphic designer. He was used to telling, you know, it was amazing what he achieved, quite frankly. But so I think that's kind of why he was both very compelling, but he'd had these kind of previous successes as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about the question also. Why? I don't have a good answer to it. I think, of course, there are moments, and it would be interesting to get to know how these moments show up. I mean, one of the first filmmakers that was at least Turkish background, let us call it that way. Tevfik Başar, 1985, with 40 Quadratmeter Deutschland could be some kind of inspiration for this ZDF Kleine Fernsehspiel. So there were somehow people that having that identity category, or fulfilling this identity category and being able to make these films. I mean, that's an interesting question, to trace how these decisions were made. I don't know a lot about it, but I think many things come together. People that want to represent something, tell something which moves them, they have to find the way for it, and the openness of an editor coming together and making these things possible. So it's a very fruitful period where these things happened in a very intense way, I would say, and this part of the success of these filmmakers and also of ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel. And from a scholarly point of view, I mean, it's interesting to trace these things. How are the perceptions? What is the history of decision making? What is the history of giving trust to these people? What is the history of the projects? I mean, it was already told of the projects that were not produced. What is the history of this? These are the invisible moments, or the potential moments. It's a very interesting and complex question.
Sorry, can I say something about that as well?
Yeah, sure.
Do you mind? I'm just thinking about the UK, which is a very different space, obviously, but you know, there was an intense interest in multicultural debates. You know, we'd had Black Audio Film Collective and Sankofa in the 80s, amongst other CEDO, you know, through the workshops. So I think that I think there was a kind of a coming of age of those discourses, if you like, that meant that probably ZKF felt they had to respond to, you know, their own kind of migrant communities, because other people were, maybe, I mean, this is just complete speculation, but so I think that there's probably a wider kind of context and wider pressures from, you know, the rest of the kind of global north, if you like, to take account of its migrant and, you know, communities of colour. That and the 90s was a big opening up of that, you know, so yeah.
I mean, one is the aspect of representation, so being part of the screen, let's call it the screen or media. But the other thing is who watched these films? Were they made for what kind of audience were these films made? Dennis Göktürk back then speculated that rather migrant people are staying at home and watching satellite TV from Turkey rather than watching ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel. So we have to somehow deal with the history of this media consumption as well, not only representation, but somehow identification. And this is where a very difficult topic, because the line of stepping into racist stereotypes and finding authentic or trying to make a good realist cinema is very difficult, and I don't know if it was possible at all in Germany so far. I don't know. I'm skeptical about that.
But what can definitely be seen from, I mean, looking only at das kleine Fernsehspiel, is that in the middle of the 90s, especially this focus on, let's say, Turkish, Kurdish, post-migrant cinema, there were a lot of films being made, and also, as you pointed out in your presentation, it started some sort of, I don't know, movement or something. So it became a lot of filmmakers making these films and creating a huge variety of perspectives that can be maybe put under the headline of post-migrant Turkish Kurdish cinema. And I wanted to ask Rachel, you, if something of that sort can be also said of Dwoskin's cinema, because it seems, from what I know, and I have not delved into this or very little, that it's still like a singular position somehow in that whole context.
Well, I mean, Dwoskin is someone who kind of defies categorization, and that has made it very difficult for him to be kind of included in whatever canons people form. I think also disability has, been incredibly subaltern, if you like. It's not so. Now there is just starting to be debates and discussions about disability, and artists with disabilities are starting to actually claim that space. But this is kind of very late in the day. So, I mean, Steve was dealing with it very early on, really, and that also didn't actually help either, because no one quite knew what to do with it. So he is quite a singular figure, and the fact that he kind of, I mean, a lot of people who were experimental filmmakers at that time, were horrified by the fact that he took kind of big commissions and made like feature films. But then also the fact that he also made these little experimental films undermined his kind of standing as a kind of a director of feature films. So, and then his like later films that he made with very little funding, if at all, were very, very personal. So there were kind of different audiences all over the place, and very few people who could sort of follow the line along with him. So, but, and he painted, and, he was just one of these people who would just try anything,
Thank you. Other questions, comments, remarks? Yeah.
Just a thought. I mean, as we're talking about moments, I was wondering when you said, and then came Fatih Akın, and kind of there was a new era. And of course, these moments also seem to be connected to certain forms of economic logic. Like one term I missed so far was melodrama. And he brought back the melodrama of Yeşilçam in a different way to the German screen. And that was, of course, connected to different forms of production, like neoliberal production and a neoliberal mindset that was taking over in a different way. And so were the earlier films of like Yüksel or Husi or Ayşe or so, and they were also part of a particular way of producing films before that melodramatic neoliberal mindset took over. So I was wondering what you mean by how can we, when we kind of, if these moments make sense, what would it mean to push the whole thing over the cliff now, and why? What is the next moment that maybe can not sustain the form that we had before?
Yeah, I mean, it refers to the concept of discourse. Burkhard Althoff yesterday was saying, we are listening. But what does listening mean? I mean, you can't put away your knowledge, your experiences. And it refers to Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak? Actually, it's a question of listening to it. And I'm wondering, who is listening? Who's able to listen? What are the possibilities to listen to it? And it's a very harsh, actually, position that I have, is saying, step aside or let the people do the things, because, as I said, the first generation of chess workers is dying, and there are so many stories that are not told, that are still on the street, and there is so much racism going on a discursive level. We need much more efforts to try to understand ourselves, and especially with the role of film. This is something that I think ZDF Kleines Fernsehspiel cannot solve, but what's the role of film in education, or how are we engaging with film in schools? It's a question of how we want to live together and how we want to reflect ourselves. And I think there is a lot of things still possible if we are brave enough to say, come on, he is the director, but he does not need the technical know-how. He just tells us what we should do, and all the other setting, we just give it to you, just tell your story. These are possibilities that are not thought of, because film culture is, of course, a very expensive culture, and where money comes into play, it becomes very powerful. I mean, this is what you're referring to. I know that Fatih Akın's film is called, or showing Yeşilçam modality, but I can tell you from my own perspective, it's not Yeşilçam at all. It's a hybrid thing, and you can somehow refer to it, but I would not refer to it as Yeşilçam modality. This is not from my experience.
Hi, thanks for your talks. This is not a formulated question, so it may come out a bit clumsily. It's for Rachel. I was just, this is, I guess, I'm also, as you know, based in the UK. This is maybe a UK specific question, maybe not. And it's about the legacies of Dwoskin and his cinema. You mentioned that he didn't have many fans in the feminist camp in the 70s and 80s. But I feel like he's also at odds with the way in which diversity and inclusion is institutionally conceived in the UK today, which is sort of in an affirmative register mainly. I mean, this does perhaps touch also on some of the questions you were talking about in terms of representation and like the avoidance of negative stereotypes or whatever you want to call it, and the way that he shows disability. You were talking about abjection, but there's also, I mean, he's also not self-victimizing at all. He can be a perpetrator in some sense. You were hinting at this. He's a voyeur. So they're very, very morally complex, and his disability is a part of that complexity. Yeah, I was wondering, since you published this book and have thought a lot about him in the UK today, and I'm assuming also you've been talking to younger filmmakers who are taking this on, like what your reflections are on this sort of the fit or not of what he's done today.
Yeah, there's quite a lot there, because there's the kind of subject matter, and then there's the kind of, you know, form that his films take as well. And I think that the UK kind of paradigm has very much been formed through structuralist film on the one hand, or else kind of the photographic debates, or the kind of maybe Bazanian debates in the kind of more art film world on the other. And Dwoskin actually fits into neither of those. So, and also because he was so much degraded by both the structuralists and the feminists, some of the feminists in the UK, he was just completely forgotten about. So there are some works or some filmmakers or artist filmmakers who I think could fit into that paradigm of his, but hardly anybody knows about his work in the UK at all. So he's been very much lost, which was part of what we were trying to change. Of course, the other thing is that I think the discourses around feminism are changing. So in the 1970s and 80s, the women against pornography kind of side, the sex negative side of feminism was very powerful, and like artists like Mary Kelly, who were, you know, put an embargo on depicting women by men completely. That's going, you know, almost gone. And I think younger feminists, younger women, they want to depict the body, they want to depict their body. And they don't see, I think with the kind of gender fluidity, that kind of notion of like power is changing as well. But I think also a lot of people didn't actually see his work or look at his work. So they assumed a sexism when actually they didn't think about his subject position or what that might have meant, what a kind of sort of failed masculinity might do to your relationship with women, and how you might depict women and the power relationships between an able-bodied woman and a disabled man. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Hi, thank you so much for both presentations. I also have a question for you, Rachel. And this is, again, just a speculation, because I don't know anything about Dwoskin, unfortunately. But I was wondering if perhaps, because you were saying that Behindert was the first film that he made for the Das Kleine Fernsehspiel. So I was wondering if the product of himself turning the camera towards him was perhaps a part of this larger policy that the Das Kleine had, to, that demanded filmmakers to kind of make films about their own personal experiences and to thematics that were proper to them. That's one of the things that I wanted to ask you. And if you could also, since you've written so much about Dwoskin, maybe you can tell us a bit more about the relationship he had with Stein. No, were there tensions there? Was it like a smooth relationship? Was he the producer of his film, like the editor who kind of discovered him and made him an artist?
No, I mean, he was very much discovered already by the time. Yeah. So I think the relationship was very good. There was a lot of respect on both sides, but there were some quite big disagreements as well. So I was telling someone, Alejandro, earlier that Silent Cry, which was a film about anorexia or an anorexic woman, was meant to be called anorexia, and he was like told he couldn't use that term because the German public wouldn't like it and wouldn't see the film. So they think it was like in a medical film or something rather than a narrative. So there was a lot of argument about that. For example, there were the inevitable arguments about money, of course, because Steve always needed more money, of course, for his films. So there were those kinds of disagreements. But I think that he was, apart from those levels, which were quite superficial levels in many ways, I think he was very much left to his own devices. I think he gave very detailed treatments. I think that they allowed him to do pretty much what he wanted. But I think that was also partly because of, he was already in quite a commanding position. A previous feature film had been commissioned by the BFI in London. So, he was already at that level. So maybe that was why. But I think they had, from what I remember, I think they had quite a kind of convivial relationship. I can't remember what your other question was about. The demand to make a personal film. I don't know. I might go and have a delve into the archive to see, actually, because I mean his work was very personal and became more and more personal as his life continued. But yeah, no, I don't know the answer to that one.
I mean, maybe to just quickly pick up on that one thing, I was wondering, because you said that Behindert was the beginning of the second phase, and if I understood correctly, the first phase where, and that's really a very strange term, but experimental film in a more classical sense, so without narrative, and Behindert does have a strong narrative. It's basically a love film. Yeah. And I was wondering if this was something, as I said earlier, the step to take someone from this experimental film scene and put this on television, maybe one request could have been that we do need some sort of narrative. We cannot have flickering, I'm overdoing it, flickering images for 1 hour.
Yeah, well, I gave the flickering images earlier.
That was very fitting, of course.
That might well have been, and again, I'll have to kind of have another look. I think that he had, I mean, ×4, which was his first feature film, was not a narrative film. It was very much it was taken from a character in Ulysses, where he spends the night going through the kind of flesh pots of Dublin. And so, that feels very much a kind of sexual liberation film. So this was really very much his first narrative film, and that might have been. But I think he probably rose to the challenge. He probably thought he wanted to make that kind of film. I think he was always looking for new audiences and looking for new ways of working. So I think that he would have really embraced that, I think. Yeah.
Alejandro, I just want to say I see 3 questions. I see with Stephanie, and then here in the front row, you have a question, and Alex. And were there other questions? Okay, then maybe after these 3 questions and answers, we can call it a fantastic day.
Yeah.
We can. Well, I just wanted to add something, and I have one question also. I wanted just to add some information about Dwoskin's career in Germany, which probably came through the Kleines Fernsehspiel, the film that he made after Central Bazaar was after Behindert, right? Yeah, the year after or so. I was in the forum, in the Berlinale Forum, and also short films were shown at the Arsenal. We have his prints of his films here, which is maybe also because he had those German connectors to Carola and Trixie and DAD. Right, DAD was also founded, as I said at the opening, in 1963. So it was like the triangle Arsenal and Kleines Fernsehspiel and DAD, exactly. However, also here, I think his films are not very known. Chinese Checkers, like one of the short films was from, I remember this from distribution, was known and shown a lot. The others were not so shown, and we did a retrospective before he passed. I can't remember which year. However, but almost nobody showed up. Pardon? Yeah. Merle. Oh, were you one of the 10 people in the audience? Because that was really a bit. It was really a bit frustrating because it was really. It was like it was not so easy for him to travel, and he came and his work for some reason never really, and I do think it had to do with this complexity that Nicola spoke about. It's very, I mean, I always was like fascinated and not so sure what to think about it at the same time, and that, but made me really like the films a lot actually, because I could never really solve that for myself. So I do think my question would be then, because the book is now so new, what are your plans now since the book is there? So and how do you see like a new potential, new chance to create new interest in his work?
Well, we're Jenny Chamaret, who was my co-investigator on the project. She and I were co-editing an anthology on Dwoskin at the moment, which will be published by Bloomsbury when we get it out. So, I mean, you know, I don't know. I haven't got any particular plans for getting more funding or anything at the moment. I think that the Dwoskin project exhausted me, partly because it was during COVID as well, a lot of it. And also I had kind of personal tragedy during that time, and I was head of department, so I was a bit burnt out at the end of it. But obviously I care, you know, he was a really close friend of mine for 20 years, and I want to see his legacy develop. And I do think that his films are really powerful and very interesting. I think the complexity in his work, that kind of tension is really important. And I think it is very much tied to, you know, his disability and shame and, you know, his class and lots of other things. So, and I think those things are worth exploring, as well as his interest in surrealism and expressionism. So I haven't really answered your question, but, you know, apart from the anthology, I don't know, I'm kind of open to suggestions, let's put it that way.
Just one more thing, it doesn't maybe help in this, but I think what is really important also is really the role and the power of Trixie and Carola in his films. And I think it's really, his films are so strong also really because of them, because they I think probably also had, for again the same reasons as actresses in his film, must have had some difficult, like we also know it from the two of them, difficulties making the films, but they created this intensity together, which I think is really unique. So I just wanted to point out how important these two are.
I mean, I'm glad thank you for mentioning the women. So I don't want to hog the space, but just one last thing. He worked with really, you know, interesting and powerful women. So on the one hand, he was being accused of sexism, but on the other hand, he worked with, you know, Carolee Schneemann, Cozy Fanny Tutti, you know, Carola Renier, Trixie. You know, he worked with some really interesting women who were very powerful in their own right. So, you know, it's kind of, yeah, again, another paradox.
And the film Behindert is in the exhibition to see. And didn't you say that Laura Mulvey was going to write about him as a kind of an exception to the objectifying sexist view that like Sternberg and Hitchcock had, if I understand
Yeah,
correctly?
well, Trixie, the film Trixie was actually in that key text to start off with, and then she decided right at the last minute to take it out, because it was through seeing Trixie that she started to think about the gaze, and obviously then, of course, the focus became much more completely on Hitchcock, really, and Hollywood film, and she decided to take out the experimental film. But I think given the kind of debates around feminism and sexism and so forth, it would have been really interesting. History might have been very different towards Dwoskin if his work had been in that text.
So, yeah, I wanted to ask from Ömer, that you talked about this media consumption and that how TV or how like media was consumed by like people who were using the TV in that time, like the Gastarbeiters and so on. But like my question goes more because like you pay like media tax in Germany, and sometimes the contract is longer than the residence permit. So it's like you, it's like about the first. Like I have two questions. Like one is about the capacity of this media consumption, and then who's exactly like the question that you asked, like who is the audience for this? And another thing was this term that you use, post-migration. What is that? For me, it's like not understandable, but like, yeah.
I mean, I missed to link it with what I was telling later on. Sorry for that. I mean, the term showed up in 2008 by Sherman Langhoff, earlier also in academic space, and it was just to give it the name that migrants themselves somehow are able to represent themselves doing their own theater, films, culture, and sticking to or trying to refuse the migration discourse, main discourse. And my attempt actually was to say that within these whole periods you can find moments of post-migrant film making, at least, so people that are able to tell their own stories, even if the editor is still there and the whole story has to go through his subjectivity, etc., with the epistemological framework that he has, and moves it to specific directions. But you could say this is also post-migrant storytelling films, of course, even if the term back then did not exist. This could be a way of dealing with these films. And with regard to media consumption, I'm critical of how far the fantasies and the needs of specific parts of population are can be fulfilled by German media at all. I mean, I don't think that we do have enough knowledge on what. It's again this very specific tension of essentialism. I mean, you're essentializing, you're saying these are the migrant people, they want that. But if you refer to the knowledge about Yeşilçam cinema in some kind of media culture, then you could say we don't know what specific parts of this population actually want to see. This is the reason why they're referring to the broadcasting of their places of where they come from Turkey or Syria or parts, I don't know where people are coming from. They are not, their needs are not represented in the broadcasting service, I would say. And this is a reason, this is something we should work on the knowledge, on the representation, on the stories, on the way post-migrant culture or society is working. How can we find a commonality? I don't know, and I think there's less efforts to do and to somehow begegnen. Encounter. Yeah, encounter. Yes. Okay, sorry. I don't know whether it answers your question, but it's very heuristically. But okay, yeah. Sorry. long answer.
Yeah, maybe this is also a good moment to come back to Alejandro's first question about moments and the speculating about what might bring a German broadcast board to producing these films and to consider the historical moments they were made. For example, I was thinking that in the late 60s, all over Europe, but also in Germany, a lot of social movements arise. Not only the feminist movement started, but also the so-called disability movement with the Club 68, and that became then the Behindertenbewegung or the cripple movement. So this was something that occurred short before Stephen Dwoskin's film Behindert on German television, so that maybe that had also an impact. So when Ömer, you said it's about listening, then maybe it's also about the movements or the people who make someone listen, because this is just it's not just happening, but you have to bring people to listen or to step aside, and this is I think as true today as it was in the 70s or 90s, and also with like claiming post-migrant society, as you said, is at the same time descriptive, but also utopian. It's saying when you have a German perspective on German cinema, this has to include Turkish, Kurdish, Greek, Italian, Black, Asian, because they are part of this society. But this is, again, not just happening. It has to have like all these movements that create moment over moment over moment, forcing people to listen and to step aside. This is just something that I wanted to add, and maybe it's good that it happens at the end of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also say thank you, because I really think, yeah, it was an important point to make at the end. So I think we are at the end now, and we call it a perfect day. Rachel and Ömer, thank you very much for being here and your presentations. Okay.